The Vanishing. Maplewood was the kind of town where everyone knew each other. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and the local diner served the same homemade pie recipe for generations. It was safe, quiet, almost too quiet. Nothing ever happened there. Until the day Ethan Calloway disappeared. It was a warm evening in late August 2018 when Ethan, a bright-eyed 5-year-old with a mop of sandy brown hair, vanished without a trace. His mother, Lisa Calloway, had just finished setting the dinner table when she called for him. "Ethan, dinner's ready." No answer. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out of the kitchen, expecting to find him playing with his toy cars in the living room. But the room was empty. "Mark," she called to her husband, who was upstairs in his study. "Yeah? Is Ethan up there with you?" A pause. "No, I thought he was with you." Lisa felt a twinge of unease as she moved toward the staircase. "He's probably just playing in his room," she muttered to herself. She reached the doorway of Ethan's bedroom and froze. The room was silent. Too silent. The bed was unmade, his favorite stuffed rabbit sat on the floor, and the closet door was half open. But Ethan was nowhere in sight. Lisa's heart started pounding. "Ethan?" she called, her voice rising. She checked under the bed. Nothing. She yanked open the closet. Empty. By the time she ran downstairs, her voice was shaking. "Mark. He's not here." Her husband, Mark Calloway, was already heading toward her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean he's not here?" "He was just playing. He was in his room not even 20 minutes ago. I swear, I just checked on him." The unease turned to panic. They checked the backyard, the garage, even the basement, but there was no sign of their son. The doors were locked, the windows shut. It didn't make sense. Then Mark noticed something strange. The old wooden dresser in Ethan's room had been moved slightly. Just a few inches, but enough to make him pause. Did Ethan push this? Mark muttered, running his fingers along the edges. He tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe he's hiding. Lisa shook her head, eyes wide with terror. "He's not here, Mark. We have to call the police. The search begins." Within an hour, Maplewood's small police force was at the Calloway home. Officers searched every inch of the property, inside and out, while neighbors gathered outside, whispering in hushed voices. Search dogs were brought in, but the scent trail led nowhere. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No footprints leading away from the house. The only thing that stood out was the moved dresser. But that, in itself, wasn't evidence of anything. The hours ticked by. Lisa sat on the porch steps, her hands gripping her face as she rocked back and forth. Mark stood nearby, gripping his phone, hoping for a call that would never come. By nightfall, search parties had formed. Dozens of volunteers scoured the streets, the woods, and every alley in town. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating the trees. But there was nothing. It was as if Ethan had disappeared into thin air. The police questioned neighbors, reviewed security footage from nearby businesses, and even considered the possibility that Ethan had wandered off and gotten lost. But there was no evidence, no clues, nothing. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The town began to move on. But the Calloways never did. A family in ruins. Mark quit his job at the real estate firm. He couldn't focus, couldn't sell homes to happy families while his own life was crumbling. He spent his days researching missing persons cases, scrolling through online forums, trying to find any connection, any clue, that might explain what happened to his son. Lisa refused to touch Ethan's room. She kept it exactly as it was, down to the scattered toys on the floor. Some nights, she would sit in his bed, clutching his stuffed rabbit, whispering lullabies into the empty air. They became distant. They fought. The weight of their loss crushed them in ways they never imagined. Mark suspected the police had given up. They never said it outright, but he could hear it in their voices when they called to check in every few months. He could see it in their eyes when they met him in person, the quiet, unspoken pity. 2 years passed. The world forgot about Ethan Calloway. But his parents never did. And neither did Ethan. Because he was closer than anyone ever imagined, shadows in the walls. The anniversary of Ethan's disappearance came and went like a quiet storm, leaving devastation in its wake. 2 years had passed since that evening, the night Lisa Calloway's world had unraveled. She barely left the house anymore. Each morning, she woke to the same unbearable silence. She would walk into Ethan's untouched bedroom, sit on his tiny bed, and stare at the walls. Her fingers traced the lines on the dresser, the one piece of furniture that had been oddly moved the night he vanished. Sometimes, she swore she heard whispers. Other times, she convinced herself that the house was simply settling, the creaks in the walls, the shifting of the old wooden floors. Mark had stopped sleeping in their bedroom altogether. He had moved into the downstairs office, spending most of his nights reading through old case files of missing children, trying to find a pattern. Something. Anything. Their marriage was in ruins. And yet, the house remained unchanged. Frozen in time, waiting for a little boy to come home. The sound behind the dresser. One evening, Lisa sat at the dining room table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Mark wasn't home. He had taken to driving around at night, stopping at every nearby town, putting up old missing posters that were already curling at the edges. The silence in the house was suffocating. Then. Creak. Lisa sat up. The sound had come from upstairs. She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. Her rational mind told her it was nothing, just the wind shifting the old bones of the house. Then it came again. Creak. She stood slowly. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The sound wasn't coming from just anywhere. It was coming from Ethan's room. Lisa's breath quickened. She took slow, cautious steps toward the staircase, her heart pounding in her ears. With each step, the creaking noise grew fainter, like it was retreating. She reached the doorway and hesitated. The room was as it always had been. The bed was unmade, the stuffed rabbit sat in its usual place, and the dresser stood against the far wall. Nothing was out of place. She exhaled sharply. I'm losing my mind. Then. Knock. Lisa's blood ran cold. The sound had come from behind the dresser. A slow, rhythmic knock. Like small fingers tapping. She took a step forward, her breath shaking. The dresser was heavy, an old oak piece passed down from Mark's grandmother. There was no way it could move on its own. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the edges. She hesitated, what am I expecting to find? But something inside her refused to let go. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her shoulder against the dresser and shoved. It barely budged. Lisa gritted her teeth, planting her feet firmly, and pushed harder. Inch by inch, the dresser scraped against the wooden floor. Dust kicked up into the air, filling her lungs. And then. She saw it. A small, jagged hole in the wall. Lisa's hands flew to her mouth. The hole was no larger than a grapefruit, and behind it, nothing but darkness. Her heart pounded. A hole? Here? Her trembling hands reached forward. She grabbed the edge of the splintered wood and tugged, pulling away pieces until the hole grew wider. And then. She froze. A small, pale hand shot out from the darkness. Lisa screamed. She stumbled backward, her vision swimming, her breath coming in short gasps. The hand trembled. Then, slowly, a boy's face emerged from the hole. Her knees buckled. "Ethan," she whispered. The boy's eyes were wide, sunken, filled with something hollow and unreadable. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears spilled down Lisa's cheeks as she crawled forward. "Ethan. My baby. Oh my God." She reached for him. His small, frail body was shaking, his skin was paper-thin, his hair unkempt and tangled. Lisa pulled him into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. His little fingers dug into her shirt as if afraid she would let go. "Ethan," she choked. "You're alive. You're—" And then she realized something. His clothes. They were the same ones he had been wearing the night he vanished. Exactly the same. A chill ran down her spine. "Ethan," she whispered, pulling back to look at him. "Baby, where have you been?" For the first time, he made a sound. His tiny voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I was here, Mommy." Lisa's stomach lurched. "What?" He clung to her tighter. "I never left." Her world tilted. She shook her head, her hands trembling as they cupped his tiny face. "No, baby. No. We searched everywhere. You were gone for 2 years." Tears welled in his hollow eyes. "I was here." Lisa's breath came in shuddering gasps. "No. No, that's impossible." For 2 years, they had searched this house 100 times. The police had combed through every inch of it. How could he have been here? How? Her fingers traced the edges of the jagged hole in the wall, her mind spiraling. It wasn't just a hole. It was an entrance. To something else. Lisa's gaze drifted into the darkness behind the wall. A deep, narrow crawlspace stretched beyond the hole, winding into the unknown. Her stomach clenched. If Ethan had been here all along. Who had been keeping him hidden, the hollow place? Lisa's entire body trembled as she held Ethan in her arms. His small frame was frail, his ribs pressed against her as if he had barely eaten in months, years. His fingers clutched at her shirt like he was afraid she would disappear. The house had felt empty for so long. But he had been here. All along. Lisa's mind was spiraling. How was this possible? How had they never found him? They had torn this house apart looking for him. Police, search dogs, forensic teams, they had scoured every inch of the property. Yet, somehow, he had been right here. Hiding. Or worse, trapped. Lisa pulled back, cradling his face in her hands. His skin was pale, too pale, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. His lips were cracked, his eyes sunken, but what shook her the most was the sheer terror behind them. "Ethan," she whispered, forcing herself to breathe. "Baby, who did this to you?" He didn't answer. His body stiffened, his gaze flickering toward the hole in the wall. Lisa followed his eyes, her breath hitching. The crawlspace stretched beyond what she could see, its jagged wooden frame disappearing into darkness. The air that seeped from within was cold, unnaturally cold. A shiver ran down her spine. She had lived in this house for nearly 8 years. She knew every inch of it, every creaky floorboard, every hidden corner. There was no crawlspace behind this wall. This wasn't part of the house's structure. So where did it lead? And who had put Ethan inside? Lisa's hands tightened around her son's frail arms. "Was it someone we know?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did someone take you, baby? Was it?" Ethan's eyes snapped to hers. And he shook his head. Lisa's stomach dropped. "No. Not someone. Something. The hidden passage." She swallowed back the fear rising in her throat. There was only one way to get answers. Lisa turned to the crawlspace, taking a slow, cautious step forward. She crouched down, peering inside, and a deep, hollow silence filled her ears. The darkness was thick, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. The wooden boards inside looked old, too old, as if they had been here long before the house was built. A heavy chill filled the space, sending goosebumps down her arms. "Ethan," she said carefully, "was this here before?" He didn't move. Didn't speak. Then, in the faintest whisper, he murmured, "It found me." Lisa's blood turned to ice. "What?" Ethan's breathing grew ragged, his little hands shaking as they gripped her wrist. "I didn't find it," he whispered. "It found me." Lisa's throat tightened. Her entire body screamed for her to stop, to back away from the passage, to call for help. But there was something about this space, something wrong. It had taken her son. And she needed to know why. Taking a deep breath, she reached into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against the wooden walls of the crawlspace. The texture was rough and uneven, not like normal wood. It was splintered, almost, rotting. And then, a whisper. Soft. Faint. Almost familiar. Lisa's breath hitched. "Hello?" Silence. She inched forward, heart pounding, her fingers trailing along the wooden beams. And then, beneath her touch, the wood moved. Lisa yelped, stumbling backward. The entire wall of the crawlspace shifted, as if something behind it had breathed, like a living, pulsing thing. Ethan whimpered, pulling away from her. Lisa's mind raced. No. No, this is impossible. The house had been built decades ago. It was just a house. But deep inside, something told her. This place was never supposed to be found. The man in the walls. A loud bang suddenly echoed from inside the passage. Lisa gasped, grabbing Ethan and stumbling away. The dresser, now fully moved, sat like an open doorway to something that should not exist. And from the darkness, a slow, dragging sound emerged. Lisa's breath hitched. Footsteps. Not running. Not hurried. Slow. Deliberate. Coming closer. Ethan curled into her arms, his tiny body shaking violently. Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears as she reached for her phone. Her fingers fumbled against the screen, no signal. A single word whispered through her mind, "Run." She grabbed Ethan and bolted out of the room. Her feet pounded against the stairs as she raced toward the front door, adrenaline surging through her veins. Ethan clung to her as she reached the entrance, her trembling fingers unlocking the bolt. Then, click. The lights flickered. Lisa froze. The overhead bulbs buzzed, dimming, then casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. The air around her grew heavy, suffocating. Ethan let out a small, terrified whimper. And then, behind her, the sound of something stepping out of the crawlspace. Lisa refused to turn around. She shoved the door open and ran. Her bare feet hit the pavement as she sprinted down the driveway, Ethan's tiny arms wrapped tightly around her neck. The air outside was freezing, unnatural for a summer night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A porch light flickered. Lisa didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house. She banged on the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she screamed. "Please, let me in." Seconds felt like hours. Then the door swung open. Mrs. Hendricks, the elderly woman next door, stared at her with wide, confused eyes. "Lisa," she gasped. "Dear, what on earth?" Lisa didn't wait. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her. Her chest heaved as she collapsed onto the floor, Ethan still clinging to her. Mrs. Hendricks knelt beside them, concern in her eyes. What happened? Lisa's lips trembled. She turned to Ethan, who was curled against her chest, his breathing shallow. Tell her, baby, Lisa urged softly. Ethan didn't speak at first. Then, in a hoarse, quiet voice, he whispered. The man in the walls. Lisa shuddered. Mrs. Hendricks paled. What did he say? Lisa forced herself to meet her neighbor's eyes. He said there's someone in the walls. The old woman's face drained of color. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, in a whisper, she said. Oh, dear, not again. Lisa's breath caught. Again? Her blood ran cold. What do you mean again? Mrs. Hendricks swallowed hard. Her eyes darted toward the window, as if she was afraid to look at Lisa directly. She exhaled shakily. You're not the first family to lose a child in that house. Lisa's world tilted. The air in the room grew suffocating. The shadows in the corners deepened. And from outside, carried on the wind. A slow, hollow knocking sound. From inside the walls. Whispers in the walls. Lisa's entire body went numb. The words, not the first family, rang in her ears like a deafening echo. Mrs. Hendricks' face had paled significantly, her frail hands gripping the edge of her rocking chair as she stared toward the window. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, she knew something. Lisa swallowed hard, cradling Ethan protectively against her chest. His tiny fingers clutched at her sweater, his body stiff as if he were expecting something, someone, to reach for him again. The slow, hollow knocking continued. Knock. 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 It came from outside. No, not outside. Inside the walls. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Hendricks exhaled shakily. You should have never moved into that house, she murmured. Lisa's stomach twisted into knots. What do you mean? The old woman took a long, trembling breath before finally meeting Lisa's eyes. That house, she whispered, is not just yours. Lisa's fingers tightened around Ethan. What does that mean? She demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Mrs. Hendricks' hands shook as she reached for an old, yellowed photo album on the side table. She flipped through brittle pages, stopping at a black and white photograph of a family standing on the porch of what was unmistakably Lisa's house. A man, a woman, and two young children, a boy and a girl. The photo was dated 1953. Lisa's breath hitched. Who are they? Mrs. Hendricks' lips quivered. The Fergusons, she whispered. They were the first family to live in that house. But, they didn't leave it the way they were supposed to. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the photo. The boy in the picture looked eerily similar to Ethan, the same tousled hair, the same sharp eyes. A chill ran down her spine. What happened to them? Mrs. Hendricks hesitated. Then, in a hushed tone, she said. The children disappeared. Lisa's blood turned to ice. What? The old woman nodded grimly. One night, in 1955, the boy and girl simply vanished. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. Their parents swore they had just gone to bed, and by morning, they were gone. Lisa's heartbeat thundered. They searched everywhere. Just like you. But all they ever found was... knock. 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 The sound came again, sharper this time. Ethan whimpered, curling into Lisa's arms. Her hands ran soothingly over his back, though her mind was anything but calm. What did they find? She whispered. Mrs. Hendricks' lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she turned the page in the album, revealing another faded photograph. This one was different. It wasn't of the family. It was a picture of the inside of the house. Lisa recognized the narrow hallway leading toward the bedrooms. But there was something off about it. At the very end of the hall, there was a shape. A dark, hunched shape. A shadow pressed against the wall. But it wasn't supposed to be there. Lisa leaned in, her breath catching. It was a person. No, not a person. A figure. Its limbs were impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And its face. There was no face. Just a hollow, gaping void. Lisa gasped, shoving the album away. What the hell is that? Mrs. Hendricks swallowed. The Fergusons never got their children back, she said softly. But a week later, they heard knocking. Lisa's fingers dug into Ethan's back. And when they looked inside the walls, Mrs. Hendricks trailed off. She didn't have to finish the sentence. Lisa already knew. The same thing had happened to Ethan. The house remembers. Lisa barely slept that night. Even after Mrs. Hendricks offered to let them stay, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. Still waiting. Ethan refused to speak. He barely ate, barely moved. Every so often, he would glance toward the walls of the guest bedroom, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Lisa sat beside him, smoothing his hair. It's okay, baby. You're safe now. But she wasn't sure if she believed it. She wasn't sure if anywhere was safe. And then, just as her eyelids began to droop. Knock. 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 Lisa shot up, her pulse hammering. She turned toward the sound. It wasn't coming from the door. Or the windows. It was coming from the wall behind Ethan. Lisa's heart pounded. No. No, no, no. She lunged forward, grabbing Ethan and pulling him against her. His tiny body trembled violently, his breathing shallow. Then, the knocking turned to scratching. Lisa's breath hitched. The slow, deliberate scrapes ran along the drywall as if something were inside. Trying to get out. Ethan clung to her, his little fingers digging into her arm. Lisa forced herself to move, scooping him up and darting toward the hallway. She barely made it 3 steps before. Slam. The bedroom door slammed shut behind them. Lisa stumbled forward, barely catching herself. The air was wrong. Heavy. Like the house itself was breathing. She turned toward the stairs, and froze. At the bottom, near the front door. Something stood there. A tall, hunched shadow, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Lisa's blood ran cold. Her grip on Ethan tightened. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. The house creaked beneath its weight. Ethan whimpered. Lisa ran. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. She sprinted toward the attic, the only place left. Her hands shook as she yanked open the door, practically throwing Ethan inside before slamming it shut behind them. Darkness swallowed the room. Lisa pressed herself against the wooden door, her breath ragged. Ethan clung to her, burying his face into her shoulder. For a long moment, there was silence. Then. Knock. 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 Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. The sound wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the attic. Lisa turned slowly. And her breath hitched. In the dim light, at the far end of the attic, a small, wooden door stood slightly ajar. A door she had never seen before. And from within the darkness, a voice whispered. Not Ethan's. Not hers. Something else. Something old. Something hungry. Come back, little boy. The forgotten ones. Lisa's breath hitched. The whisper came again, slithering through the attic like a cold wind. "Come back, little boy." Ethan whimpered, pressing himself deeper into Lisa's arms. The wooden door at the far end of the attic stood slightly ajar. The darkness beyond it was thick, unnatural. Lisa forced herself to move, keeping Ethan tightly against her chest. She backed up toward the attic door, her fingers fumbling for the knob. Locked. Her stomach dropped. No. No, no, no. She rattled the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the attic felt heavier, pressing against her chest like a slow suffocation. And then, the whispers turned to giggles. High-pitched. Childlike. But wrong. Lisa turned toward the small wooden door. A shadow shifted inside the dark gap. Not just one. Many. She could see them now, small hands gripping the edges of the doorframe. Tiny fingers, curling over the old wood. Then, they started crawling out. Lisa's entire body turned ice cold. First, a child. Then another. And another. But these were not children. Their faces were stretched, their mouths too wide. Their skin was pale, cracked, and peeling like old wallpaper. Their eyes, there were none. Just black, hollow voids where they should have been. And they were laughing. Ethan buried his face in Lisa's chest, his tiny fingers clutching her shirt so tight it almost tore. Lisa felt like screaming. One of the creatures cocked its head at her. Its mouth curled into a grin too wide for its face. "Mommy," it cooed. Lisa shuddered. Her grip on Ethan tightened. Then, the things rushed forward. Lisa threw herself against the attic door, slamming her fists against it. "Let us out," she screamed. Ethan sobbed against her shoulder. The creatures were getting closer. Too close. Their fingers reached for her. For Ethan. Then. Bang. The attic door suddenly flew open. Lisa fell backward onto the floor below, clutching Ethan as they tumbled down the short set of steps. A blast of freezing air rushed past her, sending shivers through her entire body. The attic door slammed shut behind them. Lisa scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. Silence. The whispers were gone. The laughter, gone. But the house. The house still felt alive. Ethan shuddered in her arms. Lisa turned toward the front door, her mind screaming at her to get out. She took one step. And then. A voice whispered behind her. "You can't leave. The house that eats." Lisa ran. She bolted down the hallway, gripping Ethan so tightly he could barely move. She didn't care. She had to get out. She lunged for the front door, her trembling hands fumbling at the locks. But the second she reached for the handle, the walls groaned. Deep. Heavy. Like something waking up. Lisa gasped as the floor beneath her suddenly shifted. Not an earthquake. Not normal. The wood beneath her feet bulged. Like something inside the house was moving. And then. The walls began to breathe. Lisa's entire body went cold. Ethan whimpered. The wallpaper rippled. The ceiling creaked. And then. The door melted. Lisa screamed. Right before her eyes, the wooden front door sagged like wax under a flame, its shape twisting, warping, until it disappeared completely. A wall now stood in its place. No exits. No way out. Lisa's chest tightened. This house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it wasn't going to let them leave. She turned wildly, looking for another escape. And then. She saw them. The children. Not the things from the attic. No. Real children. Dozens of them. Faded, translucent figures. Boys and girls from different eras, dressed in old-fashioned nightgowns, pajamas, and tattered clothes. Their eyes were hollow. Their faces empty. And they were watching her. A girl at the front of the group, no older than 6, tilted her head. "You found the attic door," she said in a whisper. Lisa swallowed hard. The girl stepped closer. "You weren't supposed to find it," she murmured. Lisa's heartbeat thundered. The children moved as one. Closing in. Ethan whimpered. Lisa backed away. What do you want?" she choked out. The little girl's empty eyes locked onto Ethan. "The house wants him back," she said. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, holding Ethan tighter. "You can't have him." The girl's mouth stretched into a chilling smile. "You don't have a choice." Lisa turned, ready to run. But the house had other plans. The floor cracked beneath her. Lisa let out a scream as the wood split open, and suddenly, she was falling. Down. 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 Ethan screamed. And then. Darkness. The forgotten room. Lisa hit the ground hard. Dust exploded around her, making her cough violently. Ethan whimpered in her arms, clinging to her for dear life. Lisa's hands scrambled against the cold floor, stone. Not wood. Not the house. She wasn't in the living room anymore. Her vision adjusted. And then. Her breath caught in her throat. They had fallen into a hidden basement. A place that should not exist. The walls were old, covered in symbols she didn't recognize. Bones, small bones, were scattered along the floor. And in the very center of the room. A cradle. Lisa's stomach twisted. The cradle was old, covered in dust and cobwebs. Something inside it moved. Lisa's heart slammed against her ribs. And then. A whisper. Faint. From the shadows. "You should have left when you had the chance." Lisa spun around. A tall figure stood in the darkness. Not a child. Not a ghost. Something else. Something ancient. It stepped forward, the dim light catching its face. And Lisa felt her soul freeze. Because she recognized it. It was Ethan. But not Ethan. It looked like him. A perfect copy. But its eyes were black voids. And it was smiling. Lisa's stomach churned. The thing tilted its head. "You brought him back to us," it whispered. Just like they all do. Lisa's fingers curled into fists. She would not let them take her son. She would not be the next forgotten mother. She took a deep breath. And she ran. Straight toward the monster, the final reckoning. Lisa charged forward, Ethan clutched tightly to her chest. The monster wearing Ethan's face grinned wider, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light of the forgotten basement. "You don't belong here," Lisa snarled, her voice raw with terror and fury. The thing tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement. "But we do," it whispered. "We always have." Lisa didn't stop. She couldn't. She barreled toward the creature with every ounce of strength she had left. Just as she reached it, it vanished. Lisa stumbled, nearly falling to her knees. A cold wind howled through the basement. Ethan whimpered. And then. The cradle began to shake. Lisa's heart pounded as she turned toward it. Inside, something shifted beneath the dusty, moth-eaten blankets. A tiny, skeletal hand reached out. Lisa's stomach twisted. She stepped back. The bones moved again, and a whisper filled the air. "Find me." Lisa's breath caught. The voice was not monstrous. Not evil. It was sad. She hesitated, then slowly, carefully, pulled back the blanket. And what she saw made her gasp. There, lying in the cradle, was the tiny, shriveled skeleton of a child. A boy. No. Not just any boy. The first boy. The one who had been here before all the others. Lisa covered her mouth, her heart aching. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a prison. A place where forgotten children were taken, and never allowed to leave. And Ethan was meant to be the next one. Lisa clenched her jaw. Not my son. She whirled around, her eyes darting over the ancient symbols scrawled across the walls. They weren't random. They were words. A name. Lisa ran her fingers over the letters. It was faded. Old. But she could still make it out. Matthias. The first child. The one they had all forgotten. Lisa turned back to the skeletal remains. I see you, she whispered. The air in the room shifted. A low, sorrowful sigh echoed through the chamber. Then, a voice. Help me. Lisa swallowed hard. What do I do? She whispered. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the entire house began to shake. Lisa barely had time to react before the floor split apart beneath her. She clutched Ethan tighter, trying to hold on to something, anything, as the basement collapsed. And then, they were falling. The nightmare's core. Lisa hit the ground hard. Pain shot through her body. She groaned, struggling to sit up, Ethan still in her arms. She blinked rapidly, her vision adjusting. They were no longer in the basement. They were in a cavernous space. The walls were pulsing. Alive. And in the center of the room, they were waiting. The children. Not ghosts. Not monsters. But trapped souls. All of them. Hundreds. Their hollow eyes stared at Lisa, their small, frail bodies shifting in the dim light. And in the very center of them stood Matthias. The first one. He was still just a child, but his eyes were filled with centuries of sorrow. You have to break the cycle, he said softly. Lisa's breath came in short gasps. How? Matthias turned his gaze toward the pulsing walls. The house has a heart, he murmured. Lisa followed his gaze, and her stomach twisted. A massive black mass throbbed at the far end of the cavern. It was alive. It was the house. The others tried, Matthias whispered. But they were too afraid. Lisa clenched her jaw. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She would not lose Ethan. She pushed herself to her feet, Ethan still clinging to her. And she ran. The heart of the house. The ground beneath her pulsed, fighting back with every step. The walls screamed. But Lisa kept running. The mass in the center of the cavern throbbed. As she got closer, she could see faces shifting beneath its surface. The children. All of them. Lisa raised her fist. And punched the heart as hard as she could. Pain exploded through her knuckles. The house shook violently. Lisa punched again. And again. The walls cracked. The ground split apart. The house screamed. Lisa let out a roar and slammed her fist one last time. And the heart shattered. A deafening howl filled the cavern. A wave of light erupted from the broken heart, engulfing everything in its path. Lisa grabbed Ethan and held him close. The light swallowed them whole. Freedom. When Lisa opened her eyes, she was outside. The house was gone. The entire structure had collapsed into the earth, leaving nothing but an empty, desolate lot. The wind howled softly. Ethan stirred in her arms. Lisa felt tears well up in her eyes. She pressed a kiss to his forehead. They had made it. Then she heard laughter. Lisa turned. Matthias stood at the edge of the lot, his translucent figure glowing in the moonlight. The other children stood behind him. All of them. Their eyes no longer hollow. Their faces filled with peace. "Thank you," Matthias whispered. And then they were gone. Lisa let out a shaky breath. Ethan yawned softly against her shoulder. For the first time in what felt like forever. The night was silent. No whispers. No shadows. Just peace. Lisa took one last look at the empty lot. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Home.